I burned your house down, Margaret. And I'd do it again. Those were the words Helen spoke 30 years ago, standing in the ashes of what used to be Margaret's home. Words that turned best friends into sworn enemies. Words that Margaret replayed every single day for 3 decades. But tonight, this rainy October night in 2024, Helen is standing at Margaret's door, soaking wet, trembling, barely able to stand. And the truth she's about to tell will burn everything Margaret thought she knew to the ground. Margaret doesn't move when she hears the knock. Rain hammering against the windows, thunder rolling across the Virginia hills, and someone at her door at 9 p.m. She's 72, lives alone, and knows better than to answer. The knocking continues, urgent, desperate, like whoever's out there might collapse if the door doesn't open soon. She peers through the peephole. Her heart stops. Helen, 70 years old, drenched to the bone, gray hair plastered against her pale face, lips trembling from cold or fear or both. The woman Margaret swore she'd never speak to again. The woman who destroyed everything. Go away, Margaret says through the door, voice sharp as broken glass. Please. Helen's voice cracks. Please, Maggie, I'm dying. The name hits Margaret like a fist. Maggie. Nobody's called her that in 30 years. Not since before the fire. Not since they were friends. Her hand moves to the lock before her brain can stop it. She opens the door. Helen collapses into her arms. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Wishing you a wonderful day. Margaret half carries, half drags Helen inside, muscle memory taking over even as her mind screams at her to throw this woman back into the storm. She deposits Helen on the couch, the same floral couch she bought after the fire destroyed everything she owned. Helen's eyes land on it, recognition flickering across her face, then guilt, then something else Margaret can't quite read. I'll get you a towel, Margaret says, voice cold, mechanical. I don't need a towel. I need you to listen. I've been listening for 30 years. To the whispers, to the rumors, to everyone in this town telling me what a saint you are while I'm the bitter old woman who can't let go of the past. Helen flinches. That's not fair. Fair? Margaret's voice rises, 30 years of rage bubbling up. You want to talk about fair? You burned down my house, Helen. You destroyed everything I had. Every photo of my parents. Every letter from Thomas before he died. My mother's wedding ring. Everything. I know. You stood in those ashes and told me you'd do it again. I know. Helen's shout matches Margaret's, and for a moment they're not two elderly women in a quiet living room. They're back in 1994, young and fierce and breaking apart. Silence falls between them, heavy as stone. Margaret forces herself to breathe, to remember the yoga techniques her daughter taught her, to count to 10 the way the therapist suggested 20 years ago when the nightmares were still constant. She gets the towel. They'd been best friends since 1962. Met in a Woolworths when they were both 8 years old, reaching for the same cherry lollipop. Margaret let Helen have it. Helen broke it in half and shared. 62 years of friendship could fit in that one moment, the instant understanding that what you have means more when someone else has it too. They grew up together in Chester, Virginia. Went to the same schools, dated boys who were friends with each other, got married within 6 months of each other. Helen married Robert, a mechanic with gentle hands and a generous heart. Margaret married Thomas, a teacher who read poetry aloud and made her laugh until she couldn't breathe. They raised their children together, Helen's 3 boys, and Margaret's 2 girls, playing in each other's yards, sharing birthday parties and chicken pox and first heartbreaks. Their husbands became friends. Their families became one family. Thomas died first, in 1989, heart attack at 53. Robert held Margaret at the funeral while Helen watched the girls. They all grieved together. Robert died 3 years later, cancer, slow and cruel. Margaret returned the favor, holding Helen through the worst of it, sleeping on her couch for weeks after the funeral because Helen couldn't bear to be alone. We're all we have left, Helen said one night, both of them 60 years old and widowed and terrified of the future. "We'll always have each other," Margaret promised. 2 years later, Margaret's house burned down. And Helen confessed. "Why are you here?" Margaret asks now, handing Helen the towel, keeping her distance. Helen dries her face slowly, buying time, gathering courage. "I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer. They gave me 3 months. That was 2 months ago." The words should shock Margaret. They don't. She'd heard through the grapevine this town is too small for secrets, too small for privacy, too small for two old enemies to truly avoid each other. "I'm sorry," Margaret says, and means it, hating that she means it. "I'm not here for sympathy." Helen sets the towel aside, meets Margaret's eyes directly. "I'm here because I need to tell you the truth before I die. The real truth. About the fire. You already told me the truth. You said you burned it down." I lied. The room tilts. I lied, Maggie. About everything. And I need you to know why. October 15, 1994. Margaret remembers every detail. The smell of pot roast she'd made for dinner. The TV playing Murder, She Wrote. The phone call at 8:47 p.m. that changed everything. But she doesn't know what Helen remembers. Doesn't know what Helen saw. For 30 years, she's refused to ask, refused to listen, refused to give Helen the satisfaction of an audience. Now Helen talks, and Margaret listens, perched on the edge of her armchair like a bird ready to flee. "I was supposed to be in Richmond that night," Helen begins. "Remember? My son David's piano recital." Margaret nods slowly. She remembers. She'd offered to come, but Helen insisted she'd go alone, that Margaret needed rest. She'd been working double shifts at the hospital, covering for someone on maternity leave. "I left at 6, Helen continues. "Got halfway to Richmond and realized I'd forgotten David's good shoes. He was so particular about those shoes, had to be the black ones with the silver buckles. I turned around, came back to Chester." She pauses, hands twisting the towel in her lap. "I drove past your house around 8:30. Saw a car in your driveway I didn't recognize. A blue Chevy sedan." Margaret's breath catches. She remembers that car. "I almost kept driving," Helen says. "Thought maybe you had a gentleman caller. Thought good for you. Thomas has been gone 5 years, you deserve happiness." But something felt wrong. The way the car was parked half on your lawn, like someone was in a hurry. Your front door was open. Just slightly, but open. The memory surfaces in Margaret's mind. She'd been taking out the trash, left the door ajar for just a moment. "I parked down the street and watched. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Something my mother used to say about trusting your gut when your gut screams." Helen's voice drops lower, and Margaret leans forward without realizing it. 10 minutes later, a man came out of your house. Carrying things. A pillowcase full of things. I saw silver catching the streetlight, your mother's candlesticks. The ones you kept on the mantel. Ice floods Margaret's veins. She'd reported those stolen after the fire. The police said they must have burned, that sometimes metal melts in fires that hot. She'd never questioned it, too overwhelmed by grief to push back. "I should have called the police," Helen says, and now there are tears on her face, cutting through the wrinkles. "I should have, Maggie, but I didn't. I got out of my car and I followed him back inside." Helen, "He was in your bedroom, going through your jewelry box. And I snapped. I yelled at him, asked him what the hell he thought he was doing in my best friend's house." Helen's hands are shaking now, the towel falling to the floor. "He panicked, pulled out a lighter. He'd been smoking a cigarette earlier, I could smell it. He told me to back off or he'd burn the whole place down. Thought I was you, I think. Thought he was threatening the homeowner." Margaret can't breathe. "I told him I'd already called the police. I lied my cell phone was in my car, but I thought it would scare him off. Instead, he just smiled. Said, 'Fine by me,' and dropped that lighter right on your bed. On your quilts, the ones your grandmother made. The quilts." Margaret had cried for days over those quilts. The fire caught so fast, Helen whispers. Faster than anything I'd ever seen. He ran. Just dropped everything and ran. And I tried, God, Maggie, I tried to put it out. Used your bathroom water, your kitchen sink, but it just kept spreading, eating everything, and the smoke was so thick I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. She's sobbing now, full body sobs that shake her frail frame. The fire department came, pulled me out. I was covered in soot, smelled like smoke, and you came home and saw me there in the ashes, and I could see it in your eyes. You thought I did it. You thought I burned down your house. You said you did, Margaret whispers, her own tears falling now. You stood right there and said, I burned your house down and I'd do it again. Because you were looking at me with such hatred. Such pure hatred. And I realized if I told you the truth, you'd blame yourself. You'd torture yourself forever over leaving that door open, over making yourself a target. You'd never feel safe again. Helen reaches out, grabs Margaret's hand before Margaret can pull away. So I let you hate me instead. I let you think I was crazy, jealous, evil. I don't know what story you told yourself, but I let you tell it. Because hating me was easier than living in fear. Hating me gave you someone to focus on instead of jumping at every sound for the rest of your life. The room spins. 30 years of hatred built on a lie meant as kindness. 30 years of avoiding someone who'd sacrificed her reputation to protect Margaret's peace of mind. The man, Margaret manages. Did they catch him? Helen's face hardens. No, he got away. But I spent the next 30 years making sure he never came back. What do you mean? That's the second thing I need to tell you. The thing I've been doing while you hated me. Margaret pulls her hand back, stands up, walks to the window. Outside, the rain has softened to a drizzle, the storm passing as quickly as it came. Everything looks clean, washed, new. But inside this room, everything is dirty, complicated, 30 years old. I don't understand, she says to the glass, watching her reflection, an old woman who doesn't recognize herself anymore. Why didn't you just tell me? Why let me hate you? I tried, Helen says quietly. Do you remember? 3 days after the fire, I came to your daughter Linda's house where you were staying. I brought flowers and a casserole and I threw them in the trash. The memory surfaces, sharp and shameful. Right in front of you. You told me you never wanted to see me again. That I was dead to you. That if I ever came near you or your family, you'd call the police. Margaret closes her eyes. She remembers the rage, the betrayal, the bone-deep certainty that Helen had destroyed her life out of jealousy or madness or something Margaret couldn't even name. I wrote you letters, Helen continues. Dozens of them. Never sent them. What was I going to say? Sorry I let you think I'm a monster, but it's for your own good. You would have thought I was crazier than you already did. So you just let me hate you for 30 years. I let you have peace for 30 years, Helen corrects, her voice gaining strength. And I used those years to make sure that man never came back. Margaret turns from the window. What do you mean? Helen reaches into her pocket slowly, painfully, her movements those of someone whose body is giving up. She pulls out a worn photograph and holds it up. A man, mid-40s in the photo, which means 70s now if he's still alive. Rough features, cold eyes, a scar above his left eyebrow. His name is Marcus Chen. In 1994, he was a professional burglar. Targeted widows, single women, people he thought were vulnerable. Your house was the 18th he'd hit in Virginia that year. How do you? I hired a private investigator, Helen says simply. Cost me everything I had. Robert's life insurance money, my savings, everything. Took 6 months, but we found him. Found out he'd moved to North Carolina, changed his name, started over. Margaret stares at the photograph, at the face of the man who destroyed her life and never faced consequences. The investigator wanted to go to the police, Helen continues. But I knew what would happen. Court cases, testimonies. You'd have to relive everything, face him in court, let him see you afraid. I couldn't let that happen. So what did you do? Helen's smile is terrifying, not cruel, but absolutely devoid of mercy. I visited him, told him I knew exactly what he'd done, told him I had evidence, photos, witness statements, enough to send him to prison for the rest of his life. And I made him a deal. The room feels colder. He could disappear, really disappear, leave the country, change his name, never come back to the East Coast. Or I could go to the police right then with everything I had. Helen, he took the deal, left within a week. I've had people checking on him every few years, making sure he stayed gone. He's in Mexico now, married, 2 kids, works construction. Living a normal life he doesn't deserve. Margaret sits down heavily, the world reorganizing itself around this new information. All these years, Helen wasn't just protecting Margaret's peace of mind. She was actively protecting Margaret herself, spending her own money, her own resources, hunting down a criminal the police never caught. Why? Margaret whispers. Why would you do all that? Helen looks at her like the answer should be obvious. Because you're my best friend. And that's what best friends do. Margaret can't speak, can't think, can't process that the woman she's hated for 3 decades just spent those same decades being the hero Margaret never knew she needed. There's more, Helen says, and somehow that's the most terrifying thing she's said yet. She reaches into her other pocket and pulls out an envelope, yellowed, creased, the paper soft with age and handling. Margaret's name written on the front in Helen's careful cursive. I wrote this 10 years ago, Helen says. When I first got diagnosed, before it went into remission, before it came back worse. I thought I was dying then, and I couldn't stand the thought of you never knowing. But then the treatment worked, and I was too much of a coward to give it to you when I might survive and have to face your reaction. She holds it out. Margaret doesn't take it. What's in it? Everything. The whole truth. Things I couldn't say out loud even now. Tell me. Margaret's voice is steel. If you're here to confess, then confess. No more letters. No more secrets. Helen nods slowly, setting the envelope on the coffee table between them like a bridge neither is sure they can cross. The fire wasn't the only time I protected you, she says. It was just the most dramatic. She shifts on the couch, wincing, the cancer eating her from the inside, visible now in the way she moves. Do you remember Jerry Whitmore? From church? Margaret nods. Jerry Whitmore, the deacon who always seemed so helpful, so friendly, so eager to assist the widows in the congregation. He came to fix your porch in 1997. You'd mentioned it needed work, and he volunteered. I remember. He did a good job. He did. But while he was working, I saw him take a photo of your spare key, the one you kept under the garden gnome. I was driving past and saw him through my car mirror. Stopped, pretended I was just being neighborly, made small talk until he got uncomfortable and left. Margaret's hand goes to her throat. I went to his house that night. Told him I'd seen him, that I knew what he was planning. Told him if he ever came within 50 feet of you again, I'd make sure everyone in Chester knew exactly what kind of man he was. Did he? He moved to Tennessee 6 months later. But not before I'd warned every widow in our church about him. Quietly, carefully, so no one could trace it back to me or wonder why I cared so much about protecting you when everyone thought we were enemies. Helen's breathing is labored now, the effort of confession taking its toll. Then there was the contractor in 2003 who tried to overcharge you for the roof repair. I called him, pretended to be from the state licensing board, said we'd received complaints and would be investigating. He cut his price in half the next day, didn't he? Margaret nods mutely, remembering. And your daughter Linda's husband Michael. Remember when he left her in 2008? He was having an affair. Said he'd fallen out of love. He'd fallen into debt, gambling debt, owed $50,000 to some very dangerous people. He was planning to steal Linda's inheritance, the money you'd set aside for her from selling your mother's property. He needed it fast, and he was going to take it and run. How did you? I paid his debt. Helen says it simply, like discussing the weather. Took out a second mortgage on my house. paid off the men he owed. Then I told him if he ever came near Linda or your grandchildren again, I'd tell everyone what he'd done. He left, got his affair, got his fresh start. But he left without stealing from your daughter. The walls are closing in. The air is too thin. Margaret stands, paces, sits, stands again. 30 years, she says, the words sharp as glass in her throat. 30 years of watching over me, protecting me, spending your money and your time and your energy on keeping me safe while you hated me, Helen finishes. I know. And I'd do it again, Maggie. Every single time. But why? Margaret's voice breaks. Why let me hate you? Why not just tell me? Because you needed someone to blame. Helen's voice rises, fierce despite her failing body. Thomas died and you couldn't be angry at him because he didn't choose to leave you. Robert died and you couldn't be angry at me because you knew that grief. But the fire was something you could direct all that rage at. All that pain and fear and helplessness. Tears stream down Margaret's face. I gave you that, Helen says softly. I let you be angry at me instead of at the universe. I let you have a target for all those feelings that had nowhere else to go. And yes, it hurt. God, Maggie, it hurt every single day. Seeing you in town and having you look right through me. Watching your grandchildren grow up and knowing I'd never meet them. Missing you every single moment for 30 years. She stands now, unsteady, but determined. But you survived. You healed. You built a new life and found joy again, and you did it all without being afraid. That was worth more than our friendship. That was worth everything. The room trembles with the weight of 3 decades of sacrifice. I'm dying, Maggie, Helen says. And I needed you to know. Needed you to understand that you were never alone. Not for one single day in 30 years. Margaret reaches for Helen as the older woman sways, catching her before she falls. They stand like that for a moment, 2 70-year-old women holding each other up in a living room full of ghosts, and Margaret realizes this is the first time they've touched since 1994. The first time in 30 years. Sit, Margaret says, guiding Helen back to the couch. Please sit before you collapse. Helen obeys, but her eyes never leave Margaret's face, searching for something: forgiveness, understanding, absolution. There's one more thing, Helen whispers. The biggest thing. The thing that letter can't even fully explain. Margaret sits beside her this time, close enough to catch her if she falls again. What is it? Helen closes her eyes, gathering courage for whatever comes next. The fire didn't just destroy your things, Maggie. It destroyed evidence. Evidence of something I'd been trying to protect you from for months before that night. The words make no sense. Margaret shakes her head. What evidence? Evidence of what? Your financial advisor, Stephen Richards. Do you remember him? The name triggers immediate recognition. Stephen Richards, smooth talking, charming, came recommended by someone at church. Managed her investments after Thomas died, promised to make sure she'd be secure in her retirement. He embezzled from you, Helen says flatly. Over 2 years, he stole nearly $40,000 from your accounts. Small amounts at first, then bigger as he got confident you weren't paying attention. Margaret's world tilts again. I found out by accident, Helen continues. I'd gotten coffee with Diane Morrison, remember her? She worked at the bank. She mentioned something about seeing unusual activity in your accounts. Thought maybe you were being too generous with your daughters, worried you'd spend yourself poor. Helen's hands twist together in her lap. I looked into it, quietly. A friend of Robert's was an accountant. He checked the records, found the discrepancies. Stephen had been very clever, but not clever enough. We had everything we needed to prove what he'd done. Why didn't you tell me? I was going to. I had all the evidence organized in a folder in my car the night of the fire. I was going to come to your house the next morning, show you everything, help you go to the police. Understanding dawns like cold water. But the fire destroyed your evidence. Not just mine, yours too. Stephen had been keeping false records, 2 sets of books, essentially. One for you, one real set for himself. The real ones were in your filing cabinet. The one in your home office. The one that burned. Margaret remembers that filing cabinet. It had been her mother's. Oak, sturdy, full of every important document she owned. Birth certificates, tax returns, investment records. All gone. When I pulled you from the fire scene that night, when you looked at me with such hatred, I realized this was it. This was my chance to bury everything. The evidence was gone. If I told you about Stephen, you'd have no way to prove it. It would be my word against his, and I'd just been found at your burned house, covered in ash. Who would believe me? Helen's voice drops to barely a whisper. So I made a choice. I let you think I'd burned your house in some fit of madness. I let myself become the villain. And then, very quietly, over the next 3 years, I destroyed Stephen Richards's life. The air leaves Margaret's lungs. I couldn't get your money back, it was gone, spent, unreachable. But I could make sure he never did it to anyone else. I built a new case. Hired investigators. Found his other victims and oh, Maggie, there were so many others. Widows, retirees, people who trusted him because he had such a nice smile and went to such a good church. Helen's eyes are hard now, fierce despite the cancer ravaging her body. It took 3 years and most of my savings, but we built an airtight case. Got him arrested, tried, convicted. He went to prison for 12 years. Lost his license, his reputation, everything. I never heard about this, Margaret breathes. Because it happened in Maryland. He'd moved there after your fire, started fresh with new victims. The case never made news in Chester. And I made sure my name stayed out of it entirely. I was just an anonymous tipster who'd seen something suspicious. Margaret can't speak, can't process the scale of what Helen has just revealed. So you see, Helen says, the fire actually saved you in a way. If those records had survived, you would have known you'd been robbed and betrayed by someone you trusted. You would have spent years in court, fighting to get back money that was already gone, reliving the trauma over and over. Instead, you thought everything burned in an accident caused by a crazy friend. You could hate me and move on. But you lost everything too, Margaret whispers. Robert's insurance money, your savings, your house, all to protect me. I lost money, Helen corrects. I never lost what mattered. I got to watch you from afar. Got to see you rebuild, see you smile again, see you at your granddaughter's wedding looking so happy and so free. That was worth more than any amount of money. Silence falls between them, heavy with 3 decades of unspoken love. The letter, Margaret says finally, gesturing to the envelope on the table. What does it say that you haven't told me? Helen's smile is sad, knowing. It says I forgive you. For hating me. For all the years of silence. It says I understand, and I never blamed you for a single moment. She reaches out, takes Margaret's hand properly this time, and Margaret doesn't pull away. And it says that loving you even from a distance, even through your hatred, was the greatest privilege of my life. They sit in silence, hands clasped, 2 old women holding the weight of 30 years between them. Then Margaret starts to laugh. It's a broken sound at first, edged with hysteria and grief and disbelief. But it grows, becomes real, becomes cleansing. What? Helen asks, alarmed. Maggie, what is it? I've been an idiot, Margaret says through the laughter that's turning to tears. A complete and total idiot for 30 years. You weren't. I threw away my best friend because I was too proud and too angry to ask questions. I spent 3 decades nursing a grudge against someone who was sacrificing everything to protect me. I'm the villain in this story, Helen. Not you. Me. No, Helen says firmly. You were the victim. You lost your home, your possessions, your sense of safety. You had every right to be angry. But not at you. Margaret squeezes Helen's hand, feeling how frail it is, how little time they have left. Never at you. They cry together then, 30 years of grief and love and loss pouring out in the quiet of Margaret's living room. When the tears finally slow, Margaret stands. Where are you going? Helen asks. To get wine. If you're dying, we're not doing it sober. She returns with a bottle of red and 2 glasses, pours generously, hands one to Helen. To wasted years, Margaret toasts, voice bitter and fond all at once. To protected ones, Helen counters. They drink. The storm has passed completely now. Through the window, stars are visible, bright against the clean-washed sky. Tell me about the cancer, Margaret says. The real story, not the town gossip version. Helen does. Talks about the diagnosis, the failed treatments, the pain that's constant now even with medication. Talks about her children, grown men with families of their own who don't know how to deal with their mother's mortality. Talks about the hospice nurse who comes 3 times a week and pretends not to notice when Helen cries. Margaret listens, really listens, in a way she hasn't listened to anyone in years. You shouldn't be alone, she says when Helen finishes. You should be surrounded by people who love you. I am alone, Helen says simply. My boys try, but they're busy. Their own lives. I don't blame them. You're not alone anymore. Helen looks up, eyes wide. Move in with me, Margaret says, the words coming from somewhere deep and certain. However much time you have left, weeks, days, I don't care. Spend it here. Let me take care of you the way you've been taking care of me for 30 years. Maggie, I can't. You can and you will. Margaret's voice is steel wrapped in velvet. We've lost 30 years. I'm not losing another day. Helen starts to cry again, these tears different, softer, grateful. Okay, she whispers. Okay. They talk through the night, refilling glasses, bridging decades. Margaret learns about Helen's volunteer work at the women's shelter, years of quietly helping others the way she helped Margaret. Learns about the garden Helen kept, each plant named after someone she'd lost. Learns about the journal Helen maintained, documenting every time she saw Margaret in town. Every glimpse of her across a grocery store or in church, treasuring the moments when Margaret looked happy. Helen learns about Margaret's life too, the things she missed. How Margaret's daughter Linda divorced and remarried, found real love the second time. How the grandchildren asked about Grandma's friend who went crazy, and Margaret let them believe the lie rather than admit the truth she didn't know. How Margaret would sometimes drive past Helen's house late at night, never stopping, never acknowledging, but unable to completely let go. We're idiots, Margaret says around 3 a.m., both of them exhausted and wine-drunk and lighter than they've been in years. Complete idiots, Helen agrees. But we're idiots together now. Together, Helen echoes, and smiles a real smile, the first Margaret's seen in 30 years. As dawn breaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Helen falls asleep on Margaret's couch, finally peaceful. Margaret covers her with a blanket, the one her daughter made her last Christmas, and sits in the armchair watching her best friend breathe. She picks up the letter from the coffee table, opens it carefully, mindful of its age. Inside, Helen's handwriting fills 3 pages. Margaret reads every word, tears streaming down her face. The letter says everything Helen told her tonight and more. Says things Helen couldn't speak aloud, about the nights she cried herself to sleep missing her best friend. About the times she almost broke, almost confessed, almost ruined the careful protection she'd built. About how loving someone sometimes means letting them hate you if it keeps them safe. At the end, a final paragraph. If you're reading this, I'm probably gone. And I hope you can forgive me, Maggie. Not for the fire, I know now you understand that. But for all the years I stole from us. For choosing your safety over our friendship. I'd make the same choice again, but that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. You were my best friend. My sister. The other half of my heart. And even in silence, even in your hatred, you remained all those things until my last breath. I love you. I have always loved you. I will love you past dying. Your Helen. Margaret folds the letter carefully, presses it to her heart. I love you too, she whispers to the sleeping woman on her couch. And we're going to make every moment count. Helen lived for 5 more weeks. She moved into Margaret's guest room that very day, her sons bringing her things, bewildered but grateful that their mother wouldn't die alone. Those 5 weeks held more life than the previous 30 years. They cooked together, Helen directing from a kitchen chair, too weak to stand long, while Margaret did the actual work. Made the recipes they'd shared as young wives, laughing at how they'd both forgotten certain steps, filling in each other's gaps. They watched old movies and new shows, caught up on decades of culture they'd missed sharing. They talked to each other's children, building bridges, explaining as much as they could without causing more pain. They sat in the garden when Helen felt strong enough, watching birds and breathing clean air and simply existing in the same space after so long apart. And when Helen's pain grew too great, when the morphine stopped helping and breathing became work, Margaret held her hand and told her stories of their childhood, their youth, their friendship before everything broke. "Remember the lollipop?" Margaret asked on the last day, Helen's breathing shallow, eyes barely open. Helen smiled, nodded slightly. "I should have fought you for it," Margaret said, voice breaking. "Should have kept the whole thing for myself. Would have saved us both a lot of trouble." Helen's grip tightened barely, but there. "Worth it," she whispered, the last words she ever spoke. She died that afternoon, surrounded by her sons and Margaret, peaceful at last. At the funeral, Margaret stood at the podium and told a room full of shocked people the truth. All of it. The fire, the protection, the sacrifice, the 30 years of silent love. "She was a hero," Margaret said, voice steady despite the tears. "And I was too blind to see it. But I see it now. And I need all of you to know Helen Carter was the best person I've ever known. And I was honored to be her best friend." She placed a single cherry lollipop on the casket before they closed it. "For the road," she whispered. "In case you get hungry." Margaret lives alone again now, but it's different. She volunteers at the women's shelter where Helen worked, continuing her friend's legacy. She tends the garden Helen started, learning the names of every plant, every person they represent. And on rainy nights, when storms roll across the Virginia hills, she sits by her window and remembers a knock on the door that changed everything. 2 old women, 30 years of silence, one last chance at truth. It was enough. It had to be enough. And somehow, miraculously, it was.